The giant horse dragged a heavy wagon alone. What the farmer found inside would make him cry. Fletcher Knox had seen his share of strange things in 30 years working these isolated lands, but he had never ever seen anything like this. A massive black horse, a true giant of an animal, was pulling a covered wagon straight across his property. There was no driver. No one was holding the reins. No one was cracking a whip. The animal moved with a terrifying purpose, its powerful muscles straining against leather traces that should have been hooked to two horses, not one. But something was deeply wrong with this picture. The wagon was loaded down so heavy it carved deep, angry ruts into the dry earth. Yet the horse never stopped. It never rested. It never even slowed its relentless, determined pace. Fletcher squinted through the morning haze from his porch, his coffee growing cold in his hand. He searched for any sign of a rider, a driver, anyone at all. Nothing. There was only the steady rhythmic thud of hooves on hard-packed dirt and the agonizing creak of overloaded wheels. As he watched, frozen in place, the horse suddenly changed direction. It wasn't a random turn. It was precise. It was the movement of an animal following a specific, invisible route. It knew exactly where it was going. But horses don't navigate on their own. Horses don't follow maps in their heads. Someone had to be giving it commands. That's when Fletcher heard it, a faint, thin sound, carried on the wind from inside the covered wagon. It wasn't the sound of cargo shifting. It wasn't the groan of wood. It was something else, something that made the hair on his arms stand up and his blood run cold. It sounded human. The horse continued its impossible journey, disappearing for a moment behind a ridge of scattered, sun-bleached rocks. Fletcher couldn't shake what he'd seen. A perfectly trained animal following a route with deadly precision. A wagon far too heavy for a single horse to pull. And that sound, that desperate, weak sound echoing from within. Whatever was inside that wagon, it was still alive. And if Fletcher was right about what he'd heard, it was running out of time. Fletcher Knox dropped his morning coffee. The old tin cup clattered against the weathered wood of the porch. But he barely heard it. His eyes were locked on the impossible sight unfolding across his land. The massive black horse just kept going, its march relentless, dragging that overloaded wagon with the determination of an animal possessed. He'd been ranching these parts for 3 decades. He knew horses, and horses simply did not behave this way. They needed guidance. They needed commands. They needed a firm hand on the reins. Yet this giant moved with the learned precision of a trained cavalry mount, following silent orders that only it could hear. Fletcher grabbed his worn hat and stepped off the porch, his boots hitting the dusty ground with a new sense of urgency. The morning sun cast long, skeletal shadows across the barren landscape. Even in the harsh light, he could see the deep grooves the wagon wheels carved into the earth. Whatever was inside that covered wagon was heavy enough to break an axle. The horse never looked back. It never hesitated. Its massive hooves struck the ground in a perfect, powerful rhythm, muscles rippling like coiled steel beneath its dark coat. It maintained a steady, ground-eating pace that would have exhausted most animals within an hour. This one showed no sign of fatigue. It just kept going. Fletcher began to follow, keeping a safe distance, his mind racing with questions that had no reasonable answers. He saw that the horse's harness was properly fitted. The traces were secured with the skill of someone who knew their trade inside and out. This wasn't some runaway animal dragging a stolen cart. Someone had deliberately hitched this beast to this wagon. Someone had sent it on this specific journey. But where was that someone now? The sound came again as Fletcher drew closer, his heart starting to pound in his chest. That faint, desperate noise from within the canvas-covered bed. It wasn't the groan of settling wood. It wasn't the scrape of shifting cargo. It was organic. It was human. It was filled with a profound weakness that spoke of terrible suffering. His blood ran cold as the terrible realization struck him. Someone was trapped inside that wagon, and they were still alive. The horse rounded a bend, disappearing behind a cluster of weathered rocks. Fletcher quickened his pace, his heart pounding now not from exertion, but from the growing certainty that he was witnessing something awful unfold. The massive animal continued its predetermined route with the loyalty of a dog returning home. But there was no home in the direction it traveled. There was only empty wasteland and the brutal, unforgiving heat of the coming day. Fletcher broke into a run. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that every single minute could mean the difference between life and death for whoever was trapped in that rolling prison. The horse showed no signs of stopping, and time was running out for the person whose weak cries were growing fainter and fainter with each passing moment. What he would find when he finally caught up to that wagon was going to haunt him for the rest of his days. Fletcher's lungs burned as he pushed himself across the uneven terrain. He had to keep the wagon in sight as it navigated between scattered boulders and the skeletons of dry creek beds. The giant horse moved with an eerie, unnerving confidence, as if it had traveled this exact path 100 times before. The closer he got, the more details emerged that made no sense at all. The wagon's canvas cover was tied down with military precision. The knots were tight, secured at intervals that suggested someone wanted to keep the contents hidden, or maybe keep something inside from escaping. He could see fresh rope marks gouged into the wooden sides, places where additional bindings had been recently cut away. Fletcher's stomach churned as another weak sound drifted from the wagon bed. It was definitely human. A woman's voice, barely audible above the creak of the wheels and the steady rhythm of hooves. She was trying to call out, but her voice was so raw it came out as little more than a pained whisper. Then something strange happened. The horse suddenly slowed. Its massive head turned slightly, as if it were listening for something that Fletcher couldn't hear. For a hopeful second, he thought the animal might finally stop, giving him a chance to catch up. But it didn't. Instead, it adjusted its course, heading directly toward a narrow, treacherous passage between two large rock formations. Fletcher cursed under his breath. That passage led to the most desolate part of his property. It was an area he called the Devil's Anvil, a place where the nearest water source was miles away, and the summer heat could kill a healthy man in a matter of hours. If someone was injured, if someone was trapped in that wagon, they wouldn't survive long in that wasteland. He scrambled up a small rise to get a better view, his worn boots sliding on loose gravel. From this new vantage point, he could see that the wagon was riding lower than any normal load could explain. The suspension sagged under a tremendous, unnatural weight, and the horse was working harder than any animal should ever have to. That's when Fletcher noticed the blood. Dark, ugly stains had seeped through the thick canvas near the back of the wagon. They created irregular, terrifying patterns that spoke of fresh wounds. His jaw tightened. He felt a cold knot of dread form in his gut. Someone inside wasn't just trapped. They were seriously injured. They were bleeding out. The horse entered the narrow passage, its broad shoulders barely fitting between the jagged, rocky walls. Fletcher had to make a decision, and he had to make it fast. He could take the longer route around the rocks and risk losing them entirely, or he could attempt the treacherous climb over the formation and try to intercept them on the other side. Another weak cry echoed from the wagon. This time it held a note of pure desperation that cut through Fletcher like a knife. Whoever was in there knew. They knew they were running out of time. Fletcher chose the climb. His hands found purchase on the rough, sun-baked stone as he hauled himself upward. The rock was already hot from the morning sun. By midday, it would be too scorching to touch. But if he didn't act now, he might be climbing down to find a wagon carrying a corpse. The question that terrified him most wasn't what he would find inside that wagon. It was what kind of monster would load an injured woman into a covered cart and send a horse to drag her into the middle of nowhere to die. Fletcher's hands were raw and bleeding by the time he reached the top of the rock formation, but a surge of adrenaline drove him forward. Below him, the wagon emerged from the narrow passage. The giant horse maintained its steady, relentless pace despite the treacherous footing. He could see her now. Through a small gap in the canvas where the bindings had loosened, Fletcher caught his first glimpse of the woman inside. She was young, maybe 25, with dark hair matted with sweat and blood against her pale face. Her dress was torn and stained, and her wrists showed the angry red marks of rope burns. Someone had tied her up. Someone had tied her up and thrown her into that wagon like a sack of grain. Fletcher began his descent on the far side of the rocks, loose stone skittering away under his boots. The horse was moving toward what looked like an old, forgotten mining trail, a path that would take the wagon deeper and deeper into the wasteland where no one would ever find it. As he slid down the last section of rock, his boots hitting the ground hard, Fletcher called out to the horse, his voice raw. He hoped to startle it, to break its concentration, to make it stop. The massive animal's ears flicked back at the sound, but it never broke stride. Whatever training this horse had received, it was thorough. It was absolute. Fletcher hit the ground running, his legs pumping, as he finally closed the distance to the wagon. The woman's eyes were closed now. Her breathing was shallow, irregular. Blood had pooled beneath her on the rough wooden boards of the wagon bed. Her skin had the waxy, translucent pallor of someone losing too much, too fast. "Hey!" Fletcher shouted, his voice cracking with exertion. He lunged forward, grabbing at the horse's bridle as he drew alongside. The animal snorted, a powerful blast of air, and tossed its massive head. But incredibly, unbelievably, it began to slow. Years of training, of discipline, had taught it to respond to a firm hand, even the hand of a stranger. The wagon creaked to a halt. Fletcher immediately went to work on the canvas ties. His fingers fumbled with knots that had been tied by someone who never wanted them to come undone. Desperation gave him a strength he didn't know he had. When he finally pulled back the heavy canvas cover, the full, gut-wrenching horror of the situation hit him like a physical blow. The woman had been shot, twice, once in the shoulder and once in the side. Makeshift bandages, already soaked completely through with blood, suggested someone had tried to treat her wounds before loading her into the wagon. But these weren't the hurried, clumsy efforts of kidnappers trying to keep their victim alive just long enough. These were careful. These were the clean, precise ministrations of someone who cared desperately about her survival. Her eyes fluttered open as the harsh sunlight hit her face. Her pupils struggled to focus. When she saw Fletcher leaning over her, a mask of pure terror flashed across her features. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible, a dry rasp of sound. "Please, don't take me back to them." Fletcher's blood ran ice cold in his veins. This wasn't a kidnapping. This was a rescue mission. A rescue mission gone horribly, horribly wrong. Someone had been trying to save this woman, and now she was dying in the middle of nowhere because her rescuer had abandoned her. "Who did this to you?" Fletcher asked gently, his voice low. But her eyes were already closing again. The horse stamped a heavy hoof impatiently, as if it knew its mission wasn't complete. But whatever destination it had been so carefully trained to reach, Fletcher realized with a growing, sickening dread, might be nothing more than an unmarked grave in the endless, silent desert. Fletcher's hands shook as he pressed his own worn shirt against the woman's wounds, trying desperately to stem the bleeding that was steadily draining her life away. Her pulse was weak, thready, but it was there. Her breathing had stabilized slightly now that the bone-jarring motion of the wagon had stopped. "My name's Fletcher," he said softly, hoping the sound of his voice might anchor her to consciousness. "You're safe now. Can you tell me your name?" Her lips moved soundlessly for a moment before she managed a single, whispered word. "Magnolia. They call me Maggie." "All right, Maggie. I'm going to get you help. But I need you to tell me. Who shot you? Who were you running from?" Her eyes opened wider, focusing on his face with an effort that seemed to cost her everything she had left. "The Brennan brothers," she breathed, the name itself a curse. "They killed my husband. They thought they killed me too." Fletcher's jaw tightened until his teeth ached. He'd heard of the Brennan brothers. Everyone had. They were a trio of nightmares, men who had been terrorizing settlements across 3 territories. They took what they wanted, burned what they didn't, and left a trail of bodies in their wake. If they thought Maggie was dead, then whoever put her in this wagon wasn't trying to deliver her to them. They were trying to hide her. "Someone was helping you escape," Fletcher said, more a statement than a question, looking again at the careful bandaging work. "Where were they taking you?" "Doc Henley's place," Maggie whispered, her voice fading. "Old mining camp, 3 days north. Marcus." Marcus said the horse knew the way. Marcus. Fletcher filed the name away as he looked at the massive black horse. It stood patiently, a silent monument of loyalty, despite the interruption to its journey. The animal was trained, programmed. It was built to follow a specific route to a specific destination, and it had been doing exactly that when Fletcher interfered. "What happened to Marcus?" Fletcher asked, his voice gentle, though he already suspected the answer. Tears, thick and slow, leaked from the corners of Maggie's eyes, tracing clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. "Brennan's, they caught up to us at Miller's Creek. Marcus, he put me in the wagon. He told Thunder to go. He said, he said he'd hold them off and catch up later." Fletcher understood with a sickening, soul-crushing clarity. Marcus hadn't just held them off. Marcus had sacrificed himself. He had given his own life to give Maggie a chance to reach safety. He had programmed the horse to complete a journey that he knew, with absolute certainty, he would never finish himself. The loyal animal had been carrying out the final orders of a dead man. Thunder. That must be the horse's name. The great beast snorted and pawed at the dry ground. The animal's instincts, its deep-set training, were telling it to continue the mission. But Fletcher knew they'd never make it to Doc Henley's place in time. Not by a long shot. Maggie needed immediate, serious medical attention, and the nearest help was back at his own ranch. "Maggie, listen to me. I need to take you to my place," Fletcher explained, his tone urgent but calm. "It's closer, much closer than where this horse was heading. You'll bleed to death before we reach any mining camp." Fear, stark and primal, flashed in her eyes again. "How do I know?" she whispered, the question hanging in the hot, still air. "How do I know you're not working with them?" It was a fair question. Out here, trust was a currency more valuable than gold, and a poor investment could cost you your life. In her condition, trusting the wrong person meant walking right back into the trap she just escaped. Fletcher pulled his hands away from her wounds just long enough to show her. They were covered, stained, dark, and sticky with her blood. "Because I'm trying to save your life," he said simply, "and because if the Brennan brothers were paying me, they would have done a better job of it than leaving you to die alone in the desert." Maggie studied his face for a long, silent moment. She searched his eyes, looking for the truth. Then she gave the slightest nod. "Thunder won't turn around," she warned, her voice weak. "Marcus trained him too well. He'll only go forward, only on the trail." Fletcher looked at the magnificent, stubborn animal. He understood the impossible problem. They were trapped between a horse that wouldn't deviate from its dead master's programming and a woman who would die if they didn't change course immediately. Fletcher studied Thunder's massive frame, his mind racing, searching for a solution that wouldn't end with him burying Maggie in this godforsaken wasteland. The horse stood firm, its ears pricked forward, waiting for the signal to continue its programmed journey to Doc Henley's distant camp. But Maggie's breathing was becoming more labored. The makeshift bandages were already completely soaked through again. They were losing time. "Thunder," Fletcher said firmly, stepping to the horse's head and taking a firm grip on the bridle. "Easy, boy, easy." The horse's dark, intelligent eyes fixed on him, but there was no fear in them. Only unwavering, resolute purpose. Fletcher had worked with stubborn animals his whole life, but he'd never encountered one with this kind of specific, unshakable training. He needed to think like Marcus. What commands would a man use when training a horse for a mission like this? A mission where the horse might have to finish the journey alone. "Maggie," Fletcher called softly, turning back to the wagon. "What words did Marcus use with Thunder? How did he control him?" Her voice was barely a whisper now, thin and reedy. "Home," she said. "He always said home when he wanted Thunder to change direction, to go back to camp." Fletcher's heart sank. To Thunder, home was probably the mining camp where Doc Henley waited. The command would be useless. But then Maggie continued, her words slurring slightly from the blood loss. "But when Thunder got confused on the trails, when the path wasn't clear, Marcus would say, 'New home.' He'd say 'new home' and point where he wanted to go. It was a slim chance, a desperate gamble, but it was the only one they had." Fletcher positioned himself directly in front of Thunder, making sure the horse could see him clearly. He raised his arm and pointed firmly back in the direction of his ranch. "New home, Thunder," he said, his voice steady and calm. "New home." The horse's ears swiveled, its great head tilted. For a moment, just a moment, Fletcher thought he saw a flicker of uncertainty in those intelligent eyes. Thunder took a single, tentative step in the direction Fletcher pointed. Then it stopped, looking back toward the original trail, a low rumble of confusion in his chest. "New home," Fletcher repeated, his voice carrying the quiet authority he'd learned from decades of working with difficult animals. "New home, boy. This way." This time, Thunder took 3 steps before stopping again. The horse was fighting against its core programming. It was battling the last command of the man it had loved. But the new command was working. Slowly, painstakingly, with a patience Fletcher wasn't sure he possessed, he began coaxing the massive animal to turn the heavy wagon around. It took 20 precious, agonizing minutes. 20 minutes Maggie didn't have to spare. But finally, Thunder was facing the right way, facing toward Fletcher's ranch. The horse seemed confused, almost distressed by the change in direction. It tossed its head and snorted, but it obeyed the new command. "Good boy," Fletcher breathed, relief washing over him as he climbed onto the wagon seat. "Now, let's go home." As they began the slow journey back toward the ranch, Fletcher noticed something that made his chest tighten. Tucked beside Maggie in the wagon bed, almost hidden by the folds of her stained dress, was a small wooden box. Protruding from it was the corner of what looked like an old photograph. "Maggie," he asked gently, keeping his voice low, "what's in that box?" Her eyes fluttered open with a visible effort. "Marcus," she whispered. "He saved it when they burned our house. He said it was all we had left of our old life." Fletcher's hands trembled on the reins. A new, deeper understanding dawned on him, vast and heartbreaking. This wasn't just about saving a woman from a band of killers. Marcus had died protecting not just Maggie's life, but the last fragile remnants of their life together. And now Thunder, this incredible, loyal beast, was carrying those precious memories toward what Marcus had desperately hoped would be a safe harbor. The horse had been entrusted with more than just a rescue mission. He had been carrying the entire weight of two people's world. He was faithfully, stubbornly, executing the final wishes of a man who had given everything he had to protect the woman he loved. Fletcher knew he had to succeed where Marcus had failed, because the alternative wasn't just Maggie's death. It was the complete and final destruction of everything Marcus had died trying to preserve. Fletcher pushed Thunder harder than he would normally drive any horse, but the massive animal seemed to sense the urgency, pulling the heavy wagon with a renewed strength. Every few minutes, Fletcher glanced over his shoulder into the wagon bed, watching Maggie's face grow paler, watching the life seep out of her as her blood seeped through the bandages. "Stay with me, Maggie," he called over the creaking of the wagon wheels, his voice tight with fear. "We're almost there. Just hold on." But even as he spoke the words, he could see his small ranch buildings in the distance, shimmering in the heat haze, and he knew that almost might not be good enough. Maggie's breathing had become terrifyingly shallow and irregular. Twice he'd thought she'd stopped breathing entirely, his heart leaping into his throat before seeing the faint, almost imperceptible rise of her chest. When they finally thundered into his yard, Fletcher wasted no time. He'd tended enough injured animals in his life to know basic field medicine. He was no doctor, but he had clean water, sharp knives, and steady hands. He carefully lifted Maggie from the wagon, her body unnervingly light, and carried her into his small house. He laid her on his sturdy kitchen table where the light from the window was best. Her pulse was a faint, thready flutter against his fingertips, but it was still there. Working with a desperate speed, Fletcher heated water on the stove, gathered his sharpest knife, a bottle of whiskey, and clean cloth torn from his own best Sunday shirt. "This is going to hurt," he warned, though he wasn't sure if she could even hear him anymore. He poured whiskey over the wound on her side, and she didn't even flinch. That terrified him more than a scream would have. The bullet in her shoulder, he saw with some relief, had passed clean through, but the one in her side was still lodged in there, probably against a rib. Fletcher had dug bullets out of injured cattle before, more times than he could count, but he had never done this to a human being. His hands shook as he poured more whiskey over the blade of his knife and began the delicate, gruesome work of extracting the lead slug. Maggie's eyes flew open as the knife bit into her flesh. A weak, strangled cry escaped her lips, a sound of such pure agony it nearly broke Fletcher's resolve. But he forced himself to continue, his jaw clenched, sweat stinging his eyes. He knew that leaving the bullet in would mean infection. Infection would mean fever, and fever would mean certain death. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the slug came free with a wet, sickening sound that made Fletcher's stomach heave. He quickly packed the wound with clean cloth and bound it as tightly as he dared, then did the same for the simpler wound on her shoulder. Only then did he allow himself to collapse into a nearby chair, his entire body trembling, his shirt soaked through with sweat and Maggie's blood. For the next hour, Fletcher sat vigil beside the table, a silent guardian, watching Maggie's chest rise and fall as she drifted in the gray twilight between consciousness and delirium. During her brief, lucid moments, she told him fragments of her story, pieces of his shattered life. She and Marcus had been traveling west, heading for a new start in California, when the Brennan brothers had descended on their camp like vultures. Marcus had fought them. He had fought all three of them while she lay hidden, playing dead among the chaos, praying they wouldn't find her. Thunder, she whispered, had been Marcus's prized horse. Trained for the cavalry service before the war ended, the animal was smarter and more loyal than any man he'd ever known. He loved that horse more than anything, Maggie whispered, her voice a ghostly echo in the quiet room. Except me. As evening approached and the shadows grew long, Maggie's color began to slowly return. Her breathing steadied, becoming deeper and more regular. She was going to live. Fletcher realized it with a wave of profound, bone-deep relief, but as he sat there, watching over this woman who had been delivered to his doorstep by fate, he began to truly understand the incredible weight of what Thunder had carried across the desert. It wasn't just a wounded woman in that wagon. It was the last living piece of a dead man's heart. It was a promise. It was a prayer. Entrusted to the most loyal companion he'd ever known, Marcus had died believing, hoping, praying that Thunder would complete the sacred mission he couldn't finish himself. Carrying Maggie to safety, along with the small wooden box that held the last tangible proof of their shared life. The sheer magnitude of that trust in the faithful, unwavering way Thunder had honored it brought tears to Fletcher Knox's eyes for the first time in 20 years. 3 long days passed before Maggie was strong enough to sit up without help. Fletcher had barely left her side during that time. He had moved her from the hard kitchen table to his own bed, taking the rough spun floor for himself. He tended her wounds with the quiet dedication of a man who understood the profound responsibility he had inherited from Marcus. On the morning of the 4th day, her voice still weak but clear, Maggie asked to see the small wooden box that Thunder had carried all that way. Fletcher brought the chest to her bedside. Its surface was worn smooth from years of handling, a testament to its importance. With trembling fingers, Maggie lifted the lid. Inside were the treasures Marcus had managed to save from their burning home. There were photographs, faded and curled at the edges. A wedding picture showed a younger, smiling Maggie in a simple white dress, standing beside a tall man with kind eyes and a gentle, easy smile. That must be Marcus. There were other family portraits, faces of people Fletcher assumed were parents and siblings, all lost now to either death or distance. And at the very bottom of the box, nestled beneath the photographs, lay a small, leather-bound journal. Its pages were filled, cover to cover, with Marcus's careful, neat handwriting. He wrote in it every night, Maggie said softly, tears streaming unchecked down her cheeks. Even when we were running, even when we were scared out of our minds, he'd write about our day. He'd write about his hopes for our new life in California. Fletcher watched, his heart aching, as she opened the journal to a random page and began to read aloud. Her voice was thick with sorrow, but she read the words clearly. Today, Maggie found wildflowers growing beside the creek. She made a crown from them, just like she used to do when we were courting. For a moment watching her, I forgot we were running from killers. She looked so beautiful, so alive. I promised myself I will give her a whole garden full of flowers when we finally reach our new home. The words hit Fletcher like a physical blow. This wasn't just a record of their journey. This was a love letter written by a dying man to a future he would never ever see. With a shaking hand, Maggie turned to the final entry. It was dated the morning of the attack. Marcus's handwriting was hurried, the letters slanted, but it was still legible. The Brennans found our trail. I can hear their horses. If something happens to me today, I pray Thunder remembers his training. He is our only hope. Maggie is the best part of me, and if she survives, a piece of my heart will keep beating in this world. Tell her I kept my promise. Tell her I loved her until my very last breath. Fletcher had to turn away. He walked to the window, his vision blurred with tears he couldn't control. He had spent his adult life as a solitary man, a man content with his own company. He thought he understood loneliness, but reading Marcus's last word, seeing the impossible depth of love that had driven a man to sacrifice everything for another person's survival, Fletcher realized with a humbling certainty that he'd never truly understood what it meant to love someone more than your own life. He knew, Maggie whispered from the bed. He knew he was going to die, and he spent his last morning on earth writing about how much he loved me. Fletcher looked out the window at the corral where Thunder grazed peacefully. The massive horse was finally at rest, his long, impossible mission complete. The animal had carried more than just a wounded woman across the desert. He had transported a dying man's final, desperate act of love to its intended destination. That realization broke something open deep inside Fletcher's chest, releasing a flood of emotions he'd kept buried and locked away for decades. He was a different man than he had been just a few days ago. The world was a different place. And out there, in the vast, empty wilderness, the Brennan brothers were still riding free. A cold, hard knot of anger began to form in Fletcher's gut. The story wasn't over. Justice had not been served. 2 weeks later, Maggie stood beside Thunder in Fletcher's corral. Her hand rested on the massive horse's powerful neck as she prepared to say goodbye. Her wounds had healed into angry pink scars, but her strength had returned. She was determined to continue the journey Marcus had started, to reach California and the new life they had dreamed of together. Fletcher had offered to escort her to see her safely to the next town, but Maggie had gently, firmly declined. This was something she needed to do alone. She would carry Marcus's memory, Thunder's unwavering loyalty, and her own newfound strength toward the future her husband had died to give her. He saved more than just my life that day, Maggie said, stroking Thunder's dark mane. He saved the possibility of who I could become. Fletcher nodded, understanding completely. Over the past 2 weeks, he'd watched her transform from a broken, terrified victim into a woman of quiet, formidable strength. She was determined to honor the ultimate sacrifice that had preserved her life. She carried Marcus's love not as a burden to be mourned, but as wings to carry her forward. Thunder knows the way to California, she continued, her voice confident. Marcus spent months training him, showing him maps, teaching him landmarks from memory. He'll get me there safely. As Fletcher helped Maggie secure her few belongings to Thunder's saddle, including the precious wooden box, he felt something profound shift inside his own chest. Witnessing the depth of Marcus's love, seeing Maggie's resilience, it had changed him. It had opened his heart to possibilities he had long ago forgotten and dismissed. Maggie, Fletcher said quietly as she prepared to mount the great horse, what Marcus did, the way he loved you, it reminded me that some things in this world are worth risking everything for. She turned and smiled at him. It was the first truly joyful expression Fletcher had seen from her, and it lit up her whole face. He would be glad to know his story touched someone else's heart, she said. Marcus always believed love was meant to be spread, not hoarded. As Thunder carried Maggie away from the ranch, Fletcher stood and watched until they were just a small speck disappearing beyond the distant horizon. The massive horse moved with purpose once again, but this time it was moving toward hope instead of away from death. Fletcher walked back toward his house, but instead of going inside, he continued on to the small barn where he kept his own horse, a tough old roan named Rusty. It was time to ride to town. It was time to talk to the sheriff. It was time to stop living like a man afraid of loss and start living like a man who demanded justice. Marcus had shown him that love wasn't about avoiding pain. It was about embracing the possibility of joy, even with the certainty of eventual sorrow. The man had died protecting what mattered most to him, and in doing so, He had created something beautiful and powerful enough to inspire a lonely stranger to tears and to action. That evening, as Fletcher sat on his porch cleaning his rifle, watching the last colors of sunset bleed across the sky, he thought about Thunder's faithful journey. The horse had carried Maggie to safety, but he had also transported something equally precious to Fletcher's doorstep. The proof that love could survive even death, that loyalty could triumph over despair, and that sometimes the most important missions are completed not by the people who start them, but by the people who choose to honor them by finishing the fight. Fletcher wiped his eyes one final time, grateful for the hard-won lesson in love that had arrived in his life through the devotion of a giant horse and the sacrifice of a man he'd never met, but would now never forget. The wagon that had brought such sorrow had ultimately delivered the greatest gift Fletcher had ever received. The understanding that a life lived in service to love and in pursuit of justice was never ever lived in vain. The Brennan brothers had an appointment with fate, and Fletcher Knox was going to make sure they kept it. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale from the American West, where courage and destiny collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.